Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. My name is Brian Kelly, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. We like to start our Monday show with a welcome to one of our new members. This week, we're welcoming CAYA Therapies, LLC, that stands for Come As You Are, located in Grand Rapids. So welcome to Catherine Mesko and her team. And of course, we're welcoming them on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. You can learn more at consumerscu.org. All right, so let's dive into today's topic, starting with a discussion on the income tax reduction. So earlier in the year, there was some controversy about whether or not we'd actually see a reduction in the income tax. So Brian, why is this an important issue to SBAM and to our members?
Yeah, and so this is just a little bit of a brief reminder. At the beginning of this year, there was a big kind of controversy over whether or not an income tax cut would happen in the first place. So the individual income tax is the rate that most small businesses pay on their business income. So if you're a pass-through entity, an S corporation, an LLC, certainly if you're a sole proprietor where it's on Schedule C of your tax return, your business activity, this is the main business tax for the vast majority of small businesses, the individual income tax. So there was a controversy earlier this year on whether or not the state's increase in revenues would result in a decrease in the tax rate. Of course, it was really obvious based on just the state's budget and projected revenues and actual revenues that the rate must be decreased. But there were a lot of proposals to try to make changes in law to make it so that that decrease didn't trigger. At the end of the day, with the advocacy of a lot of our members, changing the law to make the tax decrease cancel was not successful. So in other words, current law stayed in place and it did force the rate down. However, the decision was made essentially by the Attorney General that the law didn't take permanent effect, that it was only a temporary change in the income tax rate that as of this year, down 0.1% compared to last year.
So is there what really, so that all happened at the beginning of this year, and now why is this back in the news?
Yeah, there's a lawsuit that has been filed by a couple of business organizations and some legislators. So the legislators, they have indicated that the legislative intent of the decrease in the income tax rate requires that it be permanent, and then a couple of business associations, Associated Builders and Contractors, and also the National Federation of Independent Businesses, along with an association called the Mackinac Center, have challenged this Attorney General interpretation of Michigan's law, and that challenge was filed last year. Essentially, it's a lawsuit against the state of Michigan, and what it's claiming, or what it's saying, is that look, the income tax rate that dropped should be permanent. It's not a temporary decline, as the Attorney General had indicated. So not terribly surprised to see this lawsuit filed, and the process has started, and we'll see where it goes from here.
All right, so pull out your crystal ball. What do you think will happen with the lawsuit? What might the outcome be?
Well, it's a lawsuit against the state. In the way the system works, it's hard to successfully sue the state and win at any level of government and win. So you start out with the odds kind of stacked against you anytime you have a lawsuit against a government, certainly a government like a state. So in this case, the Attorney General opinion that will result in the rate going back up next year. That opinion, though, was built on an extremely flimsy set of assumptions. one of the assumptions that I think will be problematic when they go to court is they have to argue successfully, the government, to defend their actions, which is to say this rate will, sure, it goes down, but it's going to pop back up next year. They have to they have to argue successfully that the term current rate actually means previous rate in the law. So what it says is that each year you take the current rate, revenues go up, and if it goes up enough, the rate goes down. What they're saying is no, that when it says current, it doesn't actually mean current. It means the previous rate. What was current last year, not what is current this year. It doesn't make any sense. But there's because you might be like, I must be missing something. Somebody's trying to reason through that. No, you're not missing something. It really is that flimsy. So that's why I think it's an interesting case, is because a lot of times there's more gray area than this one, and so like when the government has an opinion or Attorney General issues an opinion on something, it's built on something stronger than this case. And in this case, it was the outcome in mind, and they couldn't get the legislature to change they couldn't get sufficient support in the legislature to change the law. So what they had to do is change the interpretation of the law in order to get what they wanted. So it's unfortunate, and I still think that the system itself is stacked in the favor of, it's hard to successfully sue a government and win, because it's also the government that decides if you won the lawsuit, right? So it's certainly not a slam dunk type of a situation, and one that I think would probably, my guess, given who the players are, it'll probably at the end of the day be settled in the Supreme Court.
All right, well, we'll certainly keep everyone updated on that whole lawsuit. So, Brian, the governor is giving a speech on Wednesday in which she plans to lay out some policy objectives. So what do we know about what's included in this speech?
Yeah, there's been plenty of chatter around town, around Lansing, about what the contents of the speech will be. And then now there's actually been some reporting and some confirmations, I think, of what some of the main theme lines of this speech will be. And so there's three things that seem to be rising up and what the expected content will be. First is like election law, election security, election issues. So you got these, some cases in Michigan where people were charged with crimes, different types of like election tampering, election equipment tampering, that sort of thing. So there'd be something on election security. And then another one on setting a renewable standard, like 100% renewable standard. And the details on something like this matter a lot, because it's one thing to say that you want carbon neutral, that's a term, but to go to 100% renewable or 100% carbon free is different than carbon neutral. Carbon neutral gives some base load options, and so you plant extra trees to make up for some little amount of fossil fuel you use to make sure that you always have electricity, even when the sun's not shining, even when the wind isn't blowing. But because major utilities across the country, including in this state, have already adopted carbon neutral, like huge reductions in the carbon footprint and going to carbon neutral status, it's like, well, they just kind of moved the battle lines further. And in this case, saying carbon neutral is not enough, you have to go to carbon free. And that's so there's a lot of expectation that there'll be something along those lines. And then the third item is the one that I think that our members are going to be most concerned about, and that is a new mandated paid leave benefit. And it's one that would take essentially the family medical leave requirements at the federal level and then require them to be offered, but with a paid benefit for up to 15 weeks. And what I keep on hearing coming up is that it would be something like what Minnesota just passed. And Minnesota did pass a leave benefit, which has both for like a death in the family, but also for like things like surgery and medical issues, and up to 20 weeks per year. But it's, in any given category, there's other limitations of 12 weeks, up to 12 weeks in certain categories. But here, the concept is that they would create an unemployment trust fund type situation. So every employer that has employees knows what the unemployment trust fund is. You have your payroll, a certain percentage you pay into the trust fund. If a person gets laid off, then they can make a claim against the trust fund. What was done in Minnesota and what is expected to be proposed here in Michigan would be much the same, an unemployment trust fund like situation. They create a new payroll tax that employers and employees would pay into this trust fund, and when they do that, then somebody makes a claim because they have a qualifying event. They draw off the trust fund. So employers would be assessed to pay to fund the trust fund, and employees would draw from it. In a time of workforce shortages, the idea of a new paid leave benefit is difficult for many employers to stomach. But I wanted to share with you because you're going to hear a lot of talk, I think, in the coming weeks on Minnesota, and I think it makes sense for us to take a look at what's happened in Minnesota, because Minnesota, relative to a lot of other states, in poverty and education and economic growth, or economic standing, just average income levels, that sort of thing, it stacks up well, especially in the Midwest. And so more and more often people are pointing to Minnesota saying, oh yeah, we should be like Minnesota. Well, first of all, Minnesota is not diverse at all. Okay, so just understand that. Minnesota is one of the whitest states in the country. And so like when you compare states across the South, for example, states that are more diverse like Michigan, like it makes sense for us to really look at places that are more diverse that are also doing well. Like how did they get to where they're at? So that's the first point, is that Minnesota is not necessarily, it's just not a very diverse state. It's not one that compares to a state like Michigan that has rich diversity across our landscape. But second thing is that even though they, relative to other states and their relative standings today, they look strong, their growth rates are all falling. And that's something that is really concerning. If you look at this, in this case, this slide here from Business Leaders for Michigan, they do a ranking of all 50 states, and it's a composite ranking that includes a lot of different things: education, poverty, income level, economic growth. So they look at all of these things. They have fallen from number 6, they were a top 10 state, down to 28th. If you were to look at net business creation, the talent migration, median household income, business climate perception, all of these areas, they have been dropping. And so it's while Minnesota in absolute relative terms, still, because of what they've done in the past, looks strong, if you were to look at their recent performance, it doesn't look so strong. And I bring that up to share, not for demographic reasons. I don't think they're really as good a comparison a state for us to look at because their demographics are so different than ours. But then I also think that if you look at recent performance, they really shouldn't be taking for granted that their relative economic standing is going to hold up over time, given that their growth rates relative to other states are really falling. And so I wouldn't look, all that to say, I wouldn't look to Minnesota to being the panacea of what Michigan should try to do. There are other places around the country that look much more like us that have done really well. And so it makes sense to really consider everybody and not just try to model things after Minnesota. I bring up, or I focus in, I don't mean to like to degrade Minnesota. There's the state has a lot to be proud of, but it's not I just hear coming up over and over again, Michigan should be more like Minnesota. Michigan should be more like Minnesota. And they're falling. And they're falling because they're not they're taking for granted what it means to have a strong business climate. And as they keep on eroding that, as they keep on moving away from the things that made them strong in the first place, then it's created a dynamic where I think they're not a state to follow at this point in the direction that they're going. So you'll probably hear that around this big comparison of Michigan and Minnesota, and why can't Michigan be more like Minnesota? But that's I really just do not think that is an example Michigan ought to be following for many, many reasons. But most recent of which is because they're falling. They're all the things that made them strong in the past, they just seem to be chipping away at that. And with that, their growth statistics are falling, and their absolute statistics, of course, will follow that.
So let's go back to the impetus for this speech. It seems unusual to have a policy speech that's outside of the state of the state. So why is she doing this?
Yeah, that is a good question, and one that I think that is not totally obvious or apparent. Like, why a policy speech and at the end of summer? There is some thought about just how much stuff has happened throughout the beginning of the year, and a bunch of things have been put on the table. We've communicated a bunch of things we're concerned about that are on the table. And so I think that there's some sense that maybe the governor wants to try to focus the legislature on a handful of big things, as opposed to just a bunch of items that might cause controversy or just kind of less of a concentrated focus as the election cycle starts up pretty soon for the House of Representatives, to really focus in on some issues that they think are politically winners. But also, I wouldn't discount the idea of the national stage that Michigan has proposed, and we'll see whether or not it happens, because there's another legislative step that has to happen before Michigan's primaries moved up. But in terms of presidential politics, Michigan might end up being one of the earliest states in the country to hold a presidential primary. So given that the idea of kind of like Michigan taking a few extra steps to show on the national stage and take up some issues that will get some national attention, it could have to do with that too. So it's a little bit unusual, but I think it really is the governor's attempt to try to focus the legislature in and maybe capitalize on some attention that Michigan has been getting over the course of the last several months in terms of the rate of change that's happened here.
All right, well, we'll certainly be tuning in here and share all the pertinent details with our members in due time. So the Federal Reserve actually met in Jackson Hole last week with other central bankers from around the world. What did we learn from this event?
Well, they have actually suggested, first of all, Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, has really, I think, set some strong signals that there's not likely to be an immediate rate increase. So Federal Reserve will meet and decide on rate increases in the next year. Or in the next meeting that set the Fed funds rate. So will it go up by a quarter or not? I think that he is kind of essentially scripting that probably not a rate increase, but also careful to not take off the possibility that rates would increase in the future still. And so I think that there is a growing likelihood that there's a rate increase one more rate increase in the future, but not in September. And so in establishing that type of an expectation over just last week when he took media questions with some of the world bankers that were meeting there in Jackson Hole, he referred to some things that we've talked about here on the briefing. That inflation seems to be slowing. The job market has cooled off some, but not cooled off a lot. And so that idea of wanting a very clear indication of how things are going before taking another rate increase off the table, it's just kind of I guess in that sense like a mixed signal, like feeling pretty good, but not about everything. We're not gonna, I'd be really, really surprised in the September meeting if they increased rates, but and I was gonna share it with you, although I don't see it. I thought I had it popped up to share with you, but some market expectations on rate increases in today's compared to say in March, and the thought that the rates are going to increase in the future, like there's a higher amount of confidence that rates will stay higher for longer today, or a higher expectation, I should say. Back in March, it was believed that rates would be coming down by this fall. Like the rates would start coming down, and they would come down pretty rapidly. The Federal Reserve has pretty much taken that off the table, and the market expectations are maybe one more rate increase, probably not right away, and then they'll stay high for a while, like into next year, before they start coming back down. And if you think about it, when we look at our different aspects of economic performance, like the labor market has cooled off a little bit, but unemployment is still at record lows because of our demographics, and the housing market has cooled off some too. But supply, the supply constraints on both the labor market and housing have both, I think, created dynamics where the Federal Reserve's tools just don't work as fast as they have in the past.
All right, let's move on to the UAW. We actually covered potential for a strike in depth last week, and now the UAW has voted to authorize the strike. So what does this mean?
Yeah, I kind of expect that every week we'll at least do one quick update on UAW negotiations, because it does have big ramifications for us here in Michigan. If there are closures of the auto plants, and there was an authorization for a strike. So what that means is that it gives the union leadership the authority to go into these meetings and at some point call a strike, and it just happens. It doesn't need to go back for a vote. It's like free authorization. Pre-authorization was granted by 97% of the UAW membership that voted. That's, darn near unanimous support. So just kind of shows you where things are at when it comes to those negotiations. And frankly, they're not going well.
All right, let's take a look at Data Monday.
All right, let's do, I'll just go through these. I've got 3 slides because we're at the end of the month and there's not a lot of new data coming out. But we talked a little bit about China before and how it had really fallen. And looking at GDP, U.S. GDP outpacing China, boy, that's not how it's been for a long time. You see that white line is normally above the orange line. So this is definitely different times. I wouldn't read too much, though, into it like China's going to lose superpower status. I mean, it's pretty ingrained, but in terms of their growth, I think it's going to be much more difficult for them in the future. We talked about interest rates, and this is a housing affordability index for first-time home buyers. And the lower this goes means that first-time home buyer affordability is diminished. And it's been a long time since it's been this low. It's actually lower than it's been going back as long as this index has been around. But as you can see, for a while, really, from the great financial crisis when home prices went down, and then beyond that, when interest rates were low, first time home buyers could really get into homes relatively affordably compared to historical standards the last 15 years or so. But that all changed around the pandemic time, and so this index is really low, which means that supply is low, interest rates are high. That means that affordability, especially for first-time home buyers, is very low. And then we talked about credit card debt last week, and as you see, household or home equity line of credit balances starting to inch up as well. So they were home equity lines were actually going down for much of the last 2009 through 21 or so, and they're starting to climb again. So historically speaking, total amount that is owed on home equity lines is not impressively high. In fact, it's not high. It's still low by historical standards. But we saw that credit card debt was rising, and then the next kind of natural place that you're going to see that is in home equity lines of credit when debt consolidations are happening into it. So I think these are all just indications that things are slowing some. Doesn't mean recession, but it just, as they slow some with all the different things that are happening out there in the world. I mean, take, for example, home equity lines of credit are tied to prime interest rate usually, which goes up when the Federal Reserve increases interest rates. So that type of borrowing is becoming more expensive, which means less for consumer purchases, which is just part of that cooling off period and cooling out process that we see playing out. It's playing out in slow motion, but it's definitely playing out.
All right, well, thanks for the update and insight, Brian. I do want to remind everyone that SBAM is hosting a golf outing on September 14th. This actually benefits our foundation. We'd love to have you join us. It's at the Medalist Golf Course in Marshall, and that's, again, Thursday, September 14th. So visit our website to learn more and register. As a reminder, we will not be here next Monday. It's Labor Day. We will be back to our regularly scheduled Monday, Thursday shows beginning on September 7th. So we'll see you back here then. Have a great week.
See you after Labor Day, everybody.